Hello and welcome everyone to this session titled How to Write Well with Shakeel Hashim. I'm Nikki and I'll be the MC for this session. Following Shakeel's presentation, we'll move on to a live Q&A session where he will respond to your questions. You can submit questions to the swap card live discussion feature. Then after a total of about 45 minutes, we'll bring the session to an end. For now, I would like to introduce our speaker for this session. Shakeel is the head of communications at the Center for Effective Altruism. He was previously a news editor at The Economist and has worked as a journalist at a wide range of publications. Let's give it up for Shakeel.
Hello, I'm Shakeel Hashim, and today I will be giving my best advice for how to write well. So I am currently head of communications at the Center for Effective Altruism, and I was previously a news editor at The Economist and a journalist at a bunch of other places. So while I'm by no means a writing expert, I do think I've learned some useful tips over the years, which hopefully you'll find useful too. So I wanted to start off with my writing process. This is not the way everyone works, but it is the way I work, and I think it works well for most people. So I start off with a plan. I then turn that plan into a first draft. I edit it for structure, and then I edit it for style. And I think if you go through those processes, you tend to end up with a really good piece of writing, and a much better one than if you don't bother with any of that. So for the rest of this presentation, I'm going to go through that step by step of how to do this well. So this is key. Good writing requires clear thinking. There's just no way around that. If you don't know what you think, you won't be able to express those ideas clearly. And so when you're putting together your plan, you really need to figure out what it is you think and what it is you're trying to say. Now, unfortunately, I can't help you with that bit. It involves lots of research, lots of reading, and lots of thinking. Once you figure that out, though, you can then try to assemble your thoughts. So I find a bullet point structure to be really helpful. My plans always look like a series of bullet points. Often, individual bullet points might be quotes from things I've read or snippets of thoughts. And I try and assemble those into a structure that has a logical argument or logical flow that leads the reader from the starting point to the conclusion and helps explain or argue what you want it to. So ideally, by the end of that process, and this is the one I can offer the least help with, you will have a good structure and a plan that you can work with. So then the next step is turning that plan into a first draft. And the best way to do that is to just start writing. So I like this phrase, just vomit words onto the page. Really, really important that you don't overthink this bit. It's very, very easy to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. But at this point, the most important thing for you to do is to just get words down on the page. Embrace the imperfection. You can and will improve it later. What matters now is just having something that you can start to work with. So by this point, you should have a first draft. Then you can start the editing process. And I start that with editing for structure. So read your piece through and note down how you're feeling and what you're thinking while you're reading it. Does it leave you with unanswered questions? Did you forget to explain something? Is something a little bit unclear? Does it logically flow, or does it jump around a bit? Might it make more sense if the penultimate paragraph is actually further up? And is it engaging, or do you find yourself getting bored halfway through? Make a note of how you're feeling while reading it, and then try and tweak it to change those feelings. So if there's an unanswered question, answer that question. If the structure seems a little bit off or the flow's a bit weird, maybe you need to just rearrange some paragraphs. And if it's not engaging, maybe, again, you can rearrange things to try and create more of a narrative that brings you through the piece in a way that's more engaging. The other thing to think about at this point is length and what is and isn't worth keeping in. So brevity should be your aim, I think. It forces you to refine your ideas and stick to what's really important. So you could write a 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 piece on more or less anything if you go into every single detail and every single thing. But Most people won't want to read it, and the length will distract from the core point, which is the bit you're really trying to get across. So giving yourself a strict, relatively short word limit is really helpful. It forces you to be selective and really hone your ideas down to the things that really, really matter. And it will mean more people will read your work. Cool. So by the end of this process, you should have a really good structural piece, but it might not be quite as stylish as you want. So now we go on to editing for style. And that is both very fun and can be incredibly maddening. So I like to use this tip. I see but one rule to be clear. I think especially for the kind of writing that effective altruists are often doing, clarity is absolutely crucial. We are trying to express ideas or arguments in a way that other people understand them and are persuaded by them. And happily, there are hacks in a way that can get you there, get you to making a really clear piece. And a lot of these come from George Orwell, who has an excellent essay called Politics in the English Language. And in that includes a few rules for writing, which I will pick from here. So first is never use a long word where a short one will do. It's great when you can use short words and use familiar words. That's great both because it makes your writing much more accessible to people who might not have the same educational background as you or to whom English might not be their first language. And even for people who maybe are identical to you, shorter words are easier to read. They'll get through it more quickly and with less effort. And that's generally a good thing. Next, try to lose words where you can. I think this one's kind of funny because Orwell could have followed his own advice better here. I personally abbreviate this to, if you can cut a word, do. This is a useful tip both for making your writing shorter, making your writing more engaging. It often makes your writing punchier, and so people will be more receptive to the ideas within it. And never use the passive where you can use the active. So using the active voice can make it much easier to follow a sentence. And again, it makes your writing a little bit punchier, a little bit more engaging to read. So, oops. So an example here is these two sentences on malaria. The first one is written in the passive. Malaria could be eradicated by better availability of bed nets. The second is written in the active. Better availability of bed nets could eradicate malaria. Now the difference is subtle, but it is punchier and it is a bit easier to follow the second sentence. So as a good rule of thumb, aim for the active voice. But it is important to note that none of these rules are hard and fast rules. In fact, one of, I think the 6th of Orwell's rules is break any of these rules if not doing so would make your writing weird. They're good rules of thumb, but you don't need to follow them religiously. Sometimes a passive voice will be better. You kind of just have to play it by ear. It's also really good to avoid jargon. So treat your reader as intelligent, but as if they are new to the subject matter that you are writing about. So that means always try and just spell things out, explain them, write things in a way that an average person who's maybe new to the subject could understand it. So Rob Wiblin at 80,000 Hours has an excellent presentation on this about jargon. These are some examples that he's chosen. There are way more in his presentation. I'll put a link to that. But for instance, an order of magnitude bigger. If you don't know what orders of magnitude are, you won't understand that sentence. You could just say 10 times bigger. Everyone will understand that. Epistemic status sounds quite like inside-y and is a bit confusing and philosophical. You could just say confidence level. Delta is another one that particularly annoys me because it does literally just mean change. So just say change. It makes your writing more accessible and more engaging for people to read. It's also worth thinking about rhythm. So rhythm, I think, is a really underrated part of writing, good writing. It's hard to put your finger on it, but you can often just tell when something feels a bit off. I actually think this is part of the reason why a lot of AI-generated content doesn't feel quite right. I think the rhythm is just wrong. And And when your rhythm is perfect, your writing becomes way more engaging, and the reader just, it's kind of like listening to a song. You're compelled to go along with it. So it's important to try and find a really good rhythm. That can be really difficult, but there are some things that can help. You can read your prose aloud. You'll notice unnatural rhythm and cadence much more when you're speaking it than when you're reading it. You might notice while doing that you've got some really long sentences in there that are hard to get through without taking a pause in the middle. You might want to split those sentences up with commas or full stops. You also might realize that you need to vary the length of your sentences a bit. So rather than have long, 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 it's often better to do long, short, long. It just creates a better pace. And you might realize that you need to use more punctuation. So hyphens, commas, colons, semicolons are all really, really useful in adding a bit of dynamism to your writing, so to speak. And with all of this, you should be meticulous. So here's some advice from The Economist. Much of this presentation's advice is in fact drawn from The Economist writing advice. Ideally, the piece will suffer if even one sentence should be cut out. You want to keep revising things until they're as perfect as they can be within reasonable constraints of how long you're willing to spend on this. Ideally, every word should count, every sentence should count, and it should be honed to near perfection. So at The Economist, a normal piece, I think, would go through 3 or 4 rounds of editing, and the final product would be infinitely better than the original draft because that editing process just works. The only way to get a really, really good piece of writing, I think, most of the time, is by honing it over and over and over again and really spending time on it. And yes, that will take a lot of time and a lot of effort. But if you respect your reader's time, it is worth doing because your reader's time is valuable and should be treated as such. So this is a slightly silly example, but there is some truth to it. If you can save 1,000 readers 1 minute each, you'll have saved them 17 hours of their time. So you could argue that it's worth spending 17 hours to try to shave 1 minute off your text. In reality, probably not. And also in reality, you won't need 17 hours. But the point is that it is worth spending time on improving your writing. It's doing your readers a service. And as well as helping the people that would read your article anyway, if you have shorter, clearer, punchier writing, more people will read it in the first place. So the benefit of getting this right is huge. And you don't need to do all of this by yourself. And in fact, it's often better to get a second or third pair of eyes on something. Editors are essential. They help you see things that you can't see yourself. And so always try and get someone else to look at your writing and give you feedback, both on the structure and on the style. Friends and colleagues can be really good editors. I've got a couple of friends that are my go-tos where I'll send them work. Less Wrong also has a free editing service for forum posts. That's worth looking at. And I think that in the effective altruism community in particular, people are really receptive to being sent drafts. And if they have time, I think most people are very happy to look at them and offer their thoughts. So I think just be willing to ask people. People probably want to help you. And finally, I think one of the best ways to improve your writing is to just read well. So find the very best writing from past and present and devour it. Something about doing that means you'll absorb what makes it good and your writing will be much better for it. And going outside of your comfort zone is quite important here. So while you can just read the same things you read all the time, seeing how different people write, how different styles of writing differ, you'll broaden your horizons, you'll get to read some really good stuff, and you'll improve your own writing because you'll be able to draw on the best aspects from all kinds of writing and all kinds of time periods. So a few recommendations from me. These are all non-fiction essay collections from George Orwell, Susan Sontag, A.A. Gill, and Joan Didion. They're all excellent, and I am quite confident that if you read them, your writing will be better. So thank you very much for your time. I hope this was useful, and good luck with all your writing.
All right. So thank you so much, Shakeel, for that wonderful presentation. I think a lot of us, write every day, whether it be an article or a social media post or research paper, or even on the EA forum. So very relevant advice that you gave in your presentation. So I do see that we've had a number of questions submitted already. So let's kick off with the first one. So do you use software to help you write, such as Grammarly, Hemingway Editor, or an AI text generator? What are your thoughts on that?
I personally don't. I mostly find them more annoying than helpful. Although I did recently get access to Lex, the new GPT-3 writing tool, which is fun to play with, but I don't actually think it's that useful. Yeah, I think they can be useful for things like spell check. I'm not sure they're that great at actually identifying good writing. Like the tips that Grammarly offers for change this word for this word, it's clearer, are often wrong or incorrect. They miss nuance. So I personally don't use them.
Yeah, definitely understand, especially in terms of spelling. I feel like especially if you're writing a lot of stuff down, sometimes spelling gets away from you. So I think that's one way that it could definitely help. So there's another question about your take on the use of acronyms, something that's done a lot in EA or maybe in EA forum posts. How do you think you can better use acronyms to make it more understandable when writing?
I think it's completely fine to use them. I think you should always spell it out on the first mention. So at the beginning of your post, write the words effective altruism, put in brackets next to it EA, and then going forward for the rest of the post, you can write EA. But you should assume that the person reading the post doesn't have the knowledge of what the acronym means. And given that it's pretty easy to spell it out, I would often do that. Yeah.
Yes, definitely. So like keeping in mind that the audience might not know what you're talking about. So it'd be great to expound on that when you're writing. Fantastic.
And
So
especially
there's
for lots of
another
the acronyms that we use, like they're not even easily Googleable. Like
Mm.
just Googling EA will give you the games company, not us. So
Yes, very true. I agree. So when people are writing, keep in mind the acronyms that you use and make sure that we'd actually be able to Google them if we do read your articles. So there's another question about examples that illustrate the point on rhythm. So you did mention The Economist. Would you say Orwell's books are also good examples? And would you have a list of other examples that they can use?
um that is a good question. I think, yeah, The Economist is very good at rhythm. Um Orwell is, I think, I really like, there's a writer called Joel Golby. He's a freelance journalist in the UK, and he's a very funny writer, and I think is really good at rhythm. Sometimes he'll write like these insanely long sentences that are a paragraph long, and then but it works somehow because of he's like joking with it. I think he's worth reading. I think a lot of the best rhythmic writing is probably found in fiction. So just read quite widely there. Poetry as well can also be helpful because obviously rhythm's incredibly important in poetry. Shakespeare is really good at it. Yeah.
Okay, great. Great examples. Thank you so much for sharing those. And someone asked about the thinking process part that you mentioned. So what considerations do you take into account and knowing what to include in your writing? So whether that be similarities, differences, or definitions?
So I guess I start off by thinking what the purpose of the piece is. So am I trying to explain the work I've done over the last month? Or am I trying to solicit advice from people? Am I trying to persuade people of a particular argument? So I guess I start with that, and then I think, okay, well then what are the most important things? It's a lot like, I guess, so much of EA is about prioritization, and it's just very similar to that, thinking, okay, given that this is my aim, what are the things I need to prioritize to include? Yeah, like I said, though, this bit in particular is incredibly hard to give advice on. It does just require you to have a good idea of what you want to say. What I would say is like try to keep your readers in mind. So think about what are the things that might convince them, what are the questions that they might ask, and like preempt those and answer them in the post. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. So knowing, the goal and who you're talking to, I think can definitely help in you being able to write better. So that's fantastic. And for you, what would you say is your personal process of learning how to write better?
Mostly I think just doing it over and over and over again. Like I go back and I read stuff that I wrote 10 years ago and it's awful. Even at the time I thought it was good. Um, it's just got better through practice. And I think that happens with everyone, especially if you've got good editors who can look at your work and give you feedback and help you improve it. You'll pick things up over time yourself, so you no longer need them as much on certain things, though there are always things that you can improve. Paying attention to how your writing is being received as well. So not just by editors, but by audiences as well. If I don't know, I might notice that a certain kind of article does really well, like more people read it and talk about it and engage with it than others. So I should probably be doing more of that. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. So practice makes improvement, right? So the more that you're able to
Yeah.
practice, it's great.
Practice and feedback loops, I think. Yeah.
Okay, so the next question we have is editing for style. So is it important for a writer to be unique or different when presenting or writing a topic, or not necessarily? Are there situations where being unique is advantageous or disadvantageous?
Um, I do think like every writer has to find their voice. So you shouldn't just try and like copy someone else's writing style, because it will, if that doesn't come naturally to you, it will seem forced and weird, and also you might enjoy doing it. So you need to do what like feels natural and right to you, but that doesn't necessarily have to mean you're completely unique in your writing, right? Like even the very best writers in the world, you can draw similarities between them and other writers who have similar styles, or sometimes almost the same style. If you can come up with something like totally new, amazing. Given how much writing there is in the world, that's really hard. But if you can do it, great. You'll probably be able to find an audience that way. But I don't think it's essential, and I don't think you need to reinvent the wheel. Like it's possible to build an audience and have lots of fans and write really good writing, even if you're not a completely original stylist. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. So I feel like everyone has their own sense of style, the way that they communicate, is different. So definitely taking that into account. There is another question that we have about your thoughts on the current state of communication in the EA community, maybe a little bit about what you feel like is needed when you're writing for an EA audience or keeping the EA community in mind.
Yeah. I mean, one thing is like, it's really wonderful how much writing there is in the EA community. I think that's excellent. I think the quality is mixed. There is some stuff that is exceptional. There is a lot of stuff that isn't, as is the case in like all aspects of life. I think like my most common frustrations with EA like writing style is things are much, much longer than they need to be. I don't think people think about brevity or take their readers' time into consideration, as much as they should, at least. So I would like there to be more shorter writing. I think sometimes we can get too like in groupy, like using lots of jargon and turns of phrase that only people in the EA use, and it just like makes our writing less accessible to people on the outside. It makes, even if you're a new-ish EA, it makes everything feel like a bit more intimidating, I think. I know I definitely found that when I got more involved with the community. I think those are the big ones. I think the thing that EAs are very good at is the clarity, and I think that is largely because people spend a lot of time on the thinking part, so they have clear ideas and they know what they're trying to express. So that bit I think is great. I think it's just about figuring out, okay, how do you communicate those ideas in a bit of a more accessible way? Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree with you as well. Especially looking through the EA forum, a lot of the stuff there is very long. And sometimes if you don't have expertise in that particular field, it's kind of hard to follow the discussions that come on in the forum. I definitely agree with you on that, making it more accessible through the way that we express ourselves on the forum as well.
I think there's a thing here as well of like, I don't want to say that like everything should be completely accessible, because sometimes things on the forum are written for a very niche audience, and like that's the purpose of them. I don't know, especially on like the more object level stuff. Like if there's a technical AI post, I will probably not understand that. I'm not technical enough to understand them. But like I'm glad those posts exist because they are written for other technical researchers so they can discuss ideas and share ideas. So like if your audience that you're aiming for with your posts had certain levels of context or background knowledge or whatever, then it's fine to write for them. You don't need to like make everything accessible to a layman. But I think we should also be doing more stuff that is accessible to a wide audience. And I think some stuff can be made accessible to a wide audience without sacrificing very much about the post. Yeah.
Right. So that definitely goes back to audience and the goal of the written output that you have, right? So yeah, great. Do you use any particular strategies or tools for increasing focus or clearer thinking?
Not really. I'm not very good at it. I think like my process is normally I work almost entirely in Rome Research, the Notes app. So when I am starting to like, I know I'm going to write something about a topic, I'll Google around, read everything I think I need to read to understand it. I'll take notes as I'm reading, like just copy and pasting snippets from the things I'm reading. Mm-hmm. I'll then read through all of those notes, try to like figure out what I'm thinking, and what I want to say and what my conclusion is. And then, I just kind of drag and drop the notes around into the structure of my piece. And then I, turn that into an actual post. In terms of focusing, I don't know, like I try and use apps that block Twitter sometimes, but it's not my strong point. So I wouldn't say to copy my advice.
I definitely agree with the use of Post-its. I feel like it helps organize the chaos of brainstorming. So I think that's a great tool. Would you have any specific advice in particularly to give to non-native English speakers who write in English?
Not a ton, because I obviously don't know what that experience is like. My number one suggestion would probably be to try and have a native English speaker read over your final draft, because something I notice when I read things by non-native English speakers is like they can be excellent, but occasionally there'll be like a turn of phrase that just doesn't sound natural to like English ears. Maybe it's like a literal translation from another language or something. So I think always have if you can, always have a native English speaker cast an eye over it, because they can just catch those little things that are very, very hard to catch unless you have been in that country for ever. And also I think probably the reading lots tip applies even more. If you can read as much as possible in English as a non-native speaker, you'll pick up a ton from reading, and it will make your writing better. Like, my closest experience with this is I'm not a native French speaker, but I've done some reading and writing in French, and those are the things I think were most helpful for me.
Yeah, and I do feel like people in the EA community are very helpful. So definitely, if people reach out and ask you to look at their draft of things, that I think it would be fairly easy to get people to help you out with.
Yeah, definitely.
Whatever you're writing.
I think I have a really, really low bar for reaching out to people. I think people are both incredibly willing to help and also quite good at saying no. So don't worry about if you're burdening someone too much, because they'll be willing to say no, probably, if they genuinely don't have time to help you, and then no one's lost anything.
Yeah, exactly. So also, like, don't be afraid to ask if you need help with something. I think we have a very great community in terms of being able to help out one another when we can. So yeah. So we have another question about knowing when to quit. So how do you know when to quit a piece, and when do you learn, and what do you learn from that process?
I guess there are two meanings of quit here. One is like, when do you know when to stop and publish? The answer to that is you don't. You can keep going normally forever and ever and ever, as I'm sure lots of people have experienced. If you have a draft and you just keep tweaking it endlessly, that's where I think just giving yourself deadlines is incredibly helpful. Of like, this has to be published on Friday. Doesn't matter what, doesn't matter how finished it is, has to be published. That was a really useful thing about being a journalist. If I couldn't be a perfectionist forever and ever, because my editor was like, you've got to submit this now, time's up. Knowing when to quit in terms of giving up, I think normally that comes at the early-ish stages, when you've got when you're putting your plan together. If it just doesn't seem like a coherent argument, if there's like a huge hole in it, if you're realizing that what you're saying is completely anodyne and has been said by other people elsewhere in the reading that you've done, then I think, think about if it's really worth your time spending any more time on this, or if you should just call it a day. I think by the time you get to, once you've got a good plan and you've got a good structure, I think you probably shouldn't quit ever. It's better to publish something with like imperfect style than nothing, I think. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's a very interesting take on it. I think, especially when you're practicing, it's good to continue working on a piece and see where it goes. And even if it's not perfect, and that's okay. So yeah. So you did mention a little bit about practicing writing. So we do have a question about if you know any more effective ways to practice writing, and are there any specific activities that you think would improve one's writing? So whether that would be starting your own personal blog or being an intern for any type of writing organizations?
Yeah, I think the easiest way to get started is a blog or post on the EA forum. One thing you can do is take 10 minutes, brainstorm possible topic ideas, get a big list, and then cool, that's your project for the next 3 months, is just work your way through that list one at a time and write each of them, and just make sure that you publish them. I think that's really important. You have to actually get things out the door. You can't just have them taking up space on your laptop. Specific exercises, I've never really done that many like writing exercise type things. Editing exercises can be quite useful. I think it improves your writing if you read someone else's work and make suggestions to it and tweak it. because it's much easier to spot the flaws in someone else's work than it is in your own. So that can be quite helpful. Yeah, those are the two that come to mind, but mostly I'd just be like, write things, publish them, do it over and over again for years and years and years, and you'll get good.
Okay, yeah, so like just being able to get things done, get things out there. I think just putting your foot in the door of writing, I think is great. Would you have any specific advice when it comes to writing for social media, whether that be Twitter or Instagram or Facebook, things like that?
I think you need to tailor what you're doing to those platforms. Like each is very, very different in what you can get away with. Like on Twitter, obviously you've got a very strict character limit, and also depending on like what circle of Twitter you're in, there are different norms of like what tone is acceptable, like if you can be spicy or if you are really nice and friendly. Instagram obviously is much more visual, so you probably want fewer words and let the visuals do much of the work. I think, again, look at people who are doing it really well and try and figure out what works about it. So yeah, look at the best people or people you admire on Twitter and try and figure out, okay, what is it that works there? Another big thing on social media is like cadence really, really, really matters, especially if you want to build an audience. Like I'm much more familiar with Twitter than the others, but on Twitter, you need to post like multiple times a day, every day, if you want to grow an audience, because that's like how the algorithm works. So I think just bear in mind that it's not just like how good you are at writing tweets that matters on those platforms. It's also the distribution, which comes into like, how can you game the algorithm?
Yeah, so it's not just about knowing how to write, but also how to make use of what you're able to put out there and how often it goes out. Yeah. So I think you mentioned a little bit already about, posts on the EA forum and what can be improved about that. Would you have any particular pet peeves in mind when it comes to writing on the EA forum that you haven't mentioned already?
I don't think so, beyond what I've mentioned. Yeah, I think like sometimes things are too long. Sometimes things use more jargon than they need to. I think that's it. I'm sure there's other stuff, but I can't think of it.
Okay, so we do have time for a few more questions. So I'll just wait for a few more new questions to come about. But I did have some questions for you. So you did mention, certain stages in the process. What stage would you consider to be the most difficult when writing? Would it be the first draft, the structuring, the styling, or actually posting it would be the most difficult? And how do you overcome that difficulty?
I think it varies a lot for me, depending on what I'm writing about. Sometimes the like thinking, planning stage can be maddening. Yeah, struggling to figure out like what I think about something or trying to figure out how to explain those thoughts. I find doing a first draft really easy normally. I just kind of blitz through it without thinking too much. Editing for structure is fine. Editing for style can be like quite maddening, just in terms of you get really sick of looking at your writing when you're going over it over and over and over and over again. Just get kind of fed up. But it is always worth it. And sometimes it's really satisfying when you realize that, oh, I can flip this sentence around in a certain way and it sounds infinitely better.
Okay. And if there's one thing that you would want to improve about your own writing, what would it be?
I don't think I'm great at writing things that emotionally resonate. I think I'm quite good at writing things that explain things, like factual informational things. I'm much less good at writing things that get people to feel a certain way. I think that's something I would like to be better at. And I can't write fiction, like, to save my life. I'm really, really bad at fiction.
Okay. Yeah. I think it's great to know also like your strengths and weaknesses when it comes to writing. I think it's good to be, self-aware and knowing what you can work on and things like that. So yeah, I think that's great. So if there's only one thing that from your whole presentation that you would like the audience to take away, just one nugget or even from this Q&A, what would that be?
Probably the point about brevity. I think it matters more than almost anything else. Like, give yourself strict word limits, stick to them. Your writing will be way better for it.
Okay, great. So I don't see any new questions up here. So with that actually marks the end of this talk and this session. So thank you so much, Shakeel, for that. If you guys have any other questions that you would like to ask him, he'll send his email in the chat, or maybe you can find it on his swap card profile. So feel free to reach out to him. But in the meantime, thank you everyone for attending, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.